In the early 1930s, this was one of the fastest-growing neighborhoods in St. Louis. You could see shanty towns like this all over the country. Hoovervilles, they were called after the President of the United States. But the one in St. Louis was one of the biggest in the country, with as many as 3,000 people living in shacks stretching along the riverfront south of downtown. It was one of the few places in the city where blacks and whites lived together. It was big enough to have a couple of different neighborhoods, even a couple of shops and churches. Police said crime here wasn't much of a problem. This wasn't a hobo jungle. These were local people mostly, families, out of work and evicted from their homes. Most Americans never lived in a Hooverville, but many knew the real fear that if they started to fall, there might be nothing to stop them until they hit bottom. There were no food stamps or Medicaid, welfare, or unemployment checks. Government had never done that sort of thing. Charities did. But the Depression was overwhelming, and the relief organizations were turning people away. The American way of doing things just wasn't working anymore, and there were those standing by ready to say, "I told you so." St. Louis had been home to socialists and communists since the 1800s. But in the 1930s, there were a lot of disillusioned and desperate people who were listening to them.
The people who define themselves as radicals, or others who define radicals in St. Louis, I'd say at the beginning of the 1930s comprised maybe 100 people in the St. Louis area. They'd march to the streets and they'd say, unemployed workers, children, family, come with us, join with us, and come to City Hall. We're going to demand that the city give relief.
Throughout the 1930s, people were taking their problems and protests to City Hall and into the Board of Aldermen, and it wasn't always peaceful. On July 11, 1932, some 3,000 unemployed people, whites and blacks, men, women, and children, marched to the doors of City Hall and were met by the police. Bricks were thrown, tear gas, and then bullets were fired. Throughout the country, even in the nation's capital, there were marches and violent confrontations, and still no one could say that things were getting any better. There was almost no way Herbert Hoover was going to be elected to a second term in 1932. It would be up to the Democratic nominee, New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt, to deal with the economy and the growing movement for radical solutions. Manufacturing during the Depression in St. Louis slowed, but it didn't come to a stop. So while you might get laid off at one factory, you could always hope to be picked up somewhere else, at least for a while. Now, in the garment district, a lot of the workers were women, teenage girls, and they were being asked to do a lot by their families, by the companies, by union organizers, and by co-workers. Stella England did not intend to get involved in one of the great struggles of the 1930s. She just sort of got caught up in it. She was a Jefferson County farm girl who had come to the city and found work, like a lot of young women, in a garment factory on Washington Avenue.
That was hard work, and I don't think young people want to do that anymore now. Well, there was a place you could get a job. In a lot of places you couldn't even get a job then. They'd take you because they figured you could make a few dresses and they'd make money.
Some of the very same people who had led the unemployment marches on City Hall now came to Washington Avenue to organize the garment workers. They would try to convince them to go on strike and shut down their factory until the bosses accepted the union. But even though the pay was low, the hours long, and the conditions often miserable, many people in these factories simply could not afford to go on strike. They were the only ones in their families bringing home any money. But others did walk out, and their goal was to get every last worker left in that factory to join them.
Yeah, we had a picket. The place I worked, they signed up, but we, after work or before we went to work, we'd have to go picket those places. They had some real battles. Some of them I never was involved in that. Some of them people got rough. Some got a ride in a wagon down to the police station, but I never did get involved in that. They'd finally get the girls to stay out.
The point at which workers were probably most effective in protesting and changing this country was in the 1930s. It's the pivotal decade for workers. The percentage of workers who are organized into unions rises significantly to the point that they become a factor nationally and in local politics and in the local civic arena.
In this decade, there was a national effort to unionize the auto and steel industries, and there was a wave of sit-down strikes, including one at the General Motors plant at Union and Natural Bridge. At the Emerson Electric plant on Washington Avenue, workers took over the fan-making factory and held it for 53 days. Supporters brought them food, and they used a rope to haul it up to the plant. It was one of the longest sit-down strikes in the country. Neither labor nor management had to play by the rules because there weren't many rules. Not until Congress passed and the Supreme Court approved in 1937 the Wagner Act, the strongest pro-labor legislation ever passed. It set up the National Labor Relations Board, and now, if workers legally formed the union, the company would have to sit down and deal with them.
People think that the moving out of garment factories was something that happened in the 1970s, but places like Forest City Manufacturing or a number of others immediately start to move out to rural areas in the St. Louis periphery of the St. Louis economy. And then later, of course, they move south. But this is something that happens directly in response to the union drive, is the threat that they're going to move.
Emerson Electric's story turned out very differently. It brought in Stuart Symington, the future senator, to run the company. Within a few years, the maker of motors and household fans would be a major defense contractor and would be held up as an example of how labor and management could work together to win the war. The old Emerson fan plant, which later became the Sporting News Building, is now called the Lofts at 2020 Washington. They opened a model residential unit in 2003. By early 2005, they were nearly sold out.